this series, we're looking at why Christians believe Christianity to be true. And in our first part, we looked at why Christians, amongst many, believe that a God of some kind exists. In the second part, we're going to look at the Bible to ask some questions. You see, if this world is a reflection of the God who made it, well, the world has both good and bad in it. So logically, the Creator is going to be a mixture of the good and the bad. And this is, of course, what many of the Eastern religions and primitive tribal religions say. But Christianity very conveniently says, no, while evil clearly does exist, it didn't come from God and it didn't always exist. And God's not only powerful enough to one day end evil, He promises He will, just not yet. It's a big claim. And because it's in tension with our everyday experience of evil and suffering, the tension's so big, you could in fact say, God, I think you should come down here and explain this one to us personally, which is exactly what Christians believe has happened through history and through Jesus. And this makes the trustworthiness of the Bible really important, because it claims to be a record of the history through which God has revealed Himself to us, so we can know what He's like and why the world is like it is, and what our purpose here is. And over 2 billion people believe this explanation. So let's look at why.
For me, the Bible is a special book because it really shows the heart of God, and I think if I'm going to endeavour into a relationship with God, then I need to know more about who He is and the way that He's designed our life to be.
I feel like it's a reliable record of history because of some of the events that taken place in the Bible, the places were looked upon and stuff was found.
Like the Noah's Ark and how it's on exactly where they said in the Bible, and like there's no man-made way that the Ark could get on there.
The New Testament's written within, I think, a century or something of Christ's death and resurrection, but you have like Alexander the Great, I think it's like 500 years before you find any sources about him.
I believe it's inspired by God. Did God dictate it and write it? No, but He inspires the people. He gives breath to the people and brings it to life.
I feel like that people attack the Bible because the Gospels in particular talk about miracles, and miracles have this connotation that is against the nature, like the law of nature. So how could this be true?
I feel like it just holds all of God's wisdom and knowledge. Like that's how I want to be living my life. I want to be living my life for Christ, and I want to be living my life by the Bible. I think it's so important.
The Bible is an amazing and unique book. It was written over a 1,500-year time span by more than 40 authors, including kings, military leaders, fishermen and farmers, peasants and scholars. It's also been the most printed and sold book every year since the invention of the printing press. And for amusement, it's the world's most stolen book too. But it's also the world's most attacked book, because some who don't want to believe its message have felt compelled to pull it down. And this higher criticism, as it's been called, has taken place mostly in the last 200 years, usually with the support of Western public media, who'll give any person their minute of fame if they'll come up with a new way to criticize the Bible. Consider the lost Gospel of Judas, the lost tomb of Christ. Talk about the Gospel of Thomas, or the fictional book and movie The Da Vinci Code. The innuendo of all of these is the same. You can't trust the Bible. And then there's some best-selling atheist or non-God-believing authors who media have made famous, like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens in our generation, or the well-known skeptic of the prior generation, Bishop John Spong. These guys have also said you can't trust that book. But what public media hasn't reported is what's been going on in wider academia in that same period of time, proving the very opposite point. And the caliber of the academic saying the opposite isn't lightweight. In fact, it's as good as it gets. Consider Dr. Glenson Archer, whose specific speciality was working out whether ancient documents could be trusted. This brainiac even learned over 30 languages, most of them from the early Middle Eastern world and Bible times. He taught graduate seminary-level biblical criticism for over 30 years, while I struggle to even say that. He's a genuine expert, and here's what he concluded about the Bible. He said, that as he dealt with every supposed discrepancy and contradiction one after the other, his confidence in the scriptures as a record of history they claim to be kept increasing. Because every problem ended up being resolved by the information already provided in the biblical text, or alternately by new information from archaeology. In other words, once properly investigated with prejudices put aside, the idea that these accounts are historic is quite clear. So let me now show you some of the evidence you've probably never heard. And because we need to keep this really brief, we'll focus on just the New Testament for our examples. Now, for context, there are no original documents for any really ancient work or book of antiquity. So checking how reliable ancient books are is all about checking how many copies exist today, how early or late they were copied, and then by comparing all of the different copies to see how similar or different they are. And a scholar can then tell you whether an old account is accurate or not. So how many copies do we have of the New Testament books? Let's do a comparison first. Biblical scholar F.F. Bruce points out that we have about 9 or 10 good copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars, 20 copies of Livy's History of Rome, and for the second most numerous ancient document, which is Homer's Iliad, which records Greek mythologies, there are 643 manuscript copies. And all of these are considered reliable copies of what was originally written. The surprising facts for the New Testament are that there is over 5,686 Greek handwritten manuscripts alone. And then if you include the other languages, you've got more than 25,000 ancient copies, which makes it the most highly documented book from the ancient world, literally. Then in terms of how close the copies we have were made to when it was first written, to use the same examples, for Gallic Wars, we're looking at a time gap of 1,000 years from when it was first written. For the History of Rome, it's 400 years to a partial copy and 1,000 years to a full. While the Iliad does better with a 400-year gap. While for the New Testament, it's not a 400-year gap. There are undisputed fragments within 50 or less years after the original, like the John Ryland fragment. Complete books from a little over 100 years, like the Bodmer Papyrus. And compilations of most of the New Testament's books together in a single form within 200 years, like the Chester Beatty Papyri. Which is to say, there is actually no comparison to this. So why is the accuracy of this particular book so aggressively and consistently questioned? To illustrate further, let's say we somehow got rid of all 25,000 copies of the New Testament documents that we have. You know, like the books of this library, we accidentally lost them somehow. The exciting Saturday afternoon activities of Sir David Dalrymple are thus revealed, and this man must have had a rather boring life to have done this with his spare time. He was asked whether the New Testament could be put together from quotations of Bible verses found in the writings of early Christian writers. And he says, "That question roused my curiosity. And as I possessed all the existing works of the fathers, that's the church writers, of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, I commenced to search, and up until this time I have found the entire New Testament except 11 verses." He could put the New Testament together except 11 verses from third-party quotations in other books 200 years ago. And the reliability of this book is still being questioned. And there's actually a lot more evidence for the historic reliability of this book than anything that's yet been mentioned. For example, the accusations of skeptics have then suggested the New Testament books must have been written years after the event, so they're unreliable. So that has been investigated. And surprise, surprise, today on the basis of evidences, even liberal, not believing theologians and scholars like John A.T. Robinson conclude that all the New Testament books were written probably between 50 and 75 AD, exactly as claimed, written by eyewitnesses of Jesus' life or by those who recorded their accounts. Not written to make the point 100 or 200 years later, like the false Gospels of Thomas and Judas were. Or for more evidence, we could turn to archaeology, where there are now over 25,000 dig sites related to the Bible's histories. Many archaeologists have admitted that they dug holes not just expecting but hoping to find the Bible's claims to be incorrect, because public media would turn that into a newspaper headline which would help their fundraising. So while there's always room for debate around timing in archaeology, they ended up confirming again and again that this book is an accurate record of history. So what's the issue? Here it is. It's the miracles. The problem is, while all the evidences say the Bible's accounts of history are reliable, the Bible's accounts include miracles. And if you're an atheist who's decided you won't believe that a God exists, your belief system says miracles can never happen, full stop. And so the evidences don't matter to you, because they have to have it wrong because miracles don't happen. And that's the actual issue. Yet if a God exists, miracles can happen. If even just a spiritual realm exists, which 95% of the world believes, because 95% of people are religious at some level, miracles are possible. And even contemporaries of Jesus who didn't believe him admit his miracles happened. Two of the most well-known examples are Josephus, who wrote for the Romans, published in AD 93, and then the writings of the Jewish Talmud, which, among many things, confirm Jesus was a miracle worker, though it says that his power came from the devil. If you put a dozen of these not Christian writers from Jesus' time together, well, guess what you've got? You've quickly got the same history of Jesus as in the Bible. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar, who lived a good life and did miracles. He claimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate on the eve of the Passover festival, with an eclipse of the sun and an earthquake occurring when he died. His disciples believed he rose from death, and were so convinced by what they believed they'd seen that they were willing to die for that belief. Christianity then spread as far as Rome, and so on. Simon Greenleaf was a Harvard law professor. He's a noted legal mind from history too, because of some things he wrote on legal evidence that are still recognised today. He was asked to investigate the trustworthiness of the 4 gospel accounts about Jesus, called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He applied his principles of legal evidence to see if the writers were telling the truth, and came to an unexpected conclusion, because he concluded that they were. And he was so compelled by what he discovered that he changed his beliefs and became a Christian. And his story isn't a one-off. It keeps being repeated when people really investigate. In our own times, Lee Strobel was a successful journalist, and he was an atheist, which means he was more than frustrated when his wife became a Christian. So he decided to apply his skills of investigation to the Jesus story, to then write some newspaper articles to be able to prove to everyone that the Bible's accounts were unreliable. However, to his surprise and disappointment, he discovered the opposite. He admits to feeling grumpy about it for quite some time, before finally giving in to the evidences, at which point he decided to start praying. He later wrote a book about his investigation called The Case for Christ, and there's a movie as well. And what's the point of all of this? The Bible is an important book because it claims to be a record of history through which God has been making himself known to us, so we can know what he is like. And why did God need to do this? One reason is because the world is clearly a mixture of good and bad. And you wouldn't think that God was just the good unless he explained that to us, which is what Christians believe he has done. God has been working through history to give us a chance to know him and understand him and what his purposes for us here on earth are. And this is another reason Christians believe Christianity to be true. In the next part of the series, we're going to ask another question related to the Bible. You see, what if it could be shown that there is a divine hand behind the Bible? Like something miraculous, that would be useful, right? Well, as it happens, this can be shown. There are predictions that have been miraculously fulfilled, and we're going to look at this next.